places they'd never been. And where we left them was the priests who were still standing in the river on dry ground. The people had crossed. Joshua chapter 4 just kind of continues with some of that, with this idea of memorial stones. And this, for me, this chapter is also, I told you last week, Joshua chapter 3 carries a lot of weight in my life. I had the opportunity to preach after our pastor had passed, and when we were at Chapel Hill, and they called and asked last minute if I'd be willing to preach on a Sunday, and God kept pointing me to that passage, and He has continued to point me as the reminder of, hey Josh, if you'll follow me, I'll take you places that you can't go yourself. And Joshua chapter 4 is almost on the back end of a reminder of the places that God has taken us with these memorial stones. So let's jump into Joshua chapter 4, starting there in verse 1. Now it says, when all the nation had finished crossing the Jordan, the Lord spoke to Joshua, saying, take for yourselves 12 men from the people, one man from each tribe, and command them, saying, take up for yourselves 12 stones from here out of the middle of the Jordan, from the place where the priest's feet are standing firm, and carry them over with you and lay them down in the lodging place where you will lodge tonight. So verse 2 goes directly back to what Joshua had said in chapter 3, verse 12, when he was telling the people, he said, hey, this is what we're going to do. The Ark of the Covenant's in front of us. It's going to cross ahead of us into the Jordan. And then we're going to take for ourselves 12 men from the tribes of Israel, one man from each tribe. And he just kind of left it there. A precursor to, hey, we've got to have one from each tribe that's going to have a role when we cross this river. And so chapter 4 kind of spells that role out. And he told them in verse 2, he said, take for yourselves 12 men from the people, one man from each tribe, and then we're going to take up 12 stones. And depending on what you read about those stones, these weren't your small little rocks that fit in your pocket. These were, from what I understand, very large stones. It would be one where it's one man would be about all he could carry was one of those stones. So they were instructed to pick up one of these stones to make 12 of them from the middle of the Jordan, where from the place where the priest's feet are standing firm, and carry them over with you and lay them down where they're going to lodge that night. So Joshua had given those instructions. They were to gather a stone from where the priest stood. The interesting thing when I was reading through this was I was reminded of the fact that God told them they were supposed to be a specific distance from the Ark of the Covenant. God had told them, what was it, 2,000 cubits, that they were supposed to walk around that, which I'm trying to remember how, I think it was 1,000 yards is roughly that distance around the Ark of the Covenant. They weren't supposed to get any closer than that. My assumption there is that, hey, these 12 men had been given that freedom from God to go and pick up one of these rocks from where these men stood. Because they were told to gather a stone from where these men stood there in the middle of the river, and they were supposed to carry them with them. That was just an interesting thing for me. I didn't see a whole lot about that, digging into different commentaries and such about that, as far as why that would be different for these men, but it was something they were commanded to do by God. So maybe they were given special privilege. Maybe it was one of those, but it was just something that kind of stood out to me when I was looking at that, because everybody else had that distance that they had to keep. So verse 4 says, Joshua called the 12 men whom he had appointed from the sons of Israel, one man from each tribe. And verse 5 says, and Joshua said to them, cross again. So they had already gone through. This was not something they were supposed to do as they're walking through. They weren't supposed to just scoop up a rock and keep walking. No, Joshua told them, he said, cross again to the ark of the Lord your God into the middle of the Jordan. So the ark's still there. All the people had crossed by. We left chapter 3 with the men standing there with the Ark of the Covenant. And these 12 men were supposed to cross again to where the Ark of the Lord your God into the middle of the Jordan. And each of you take up a stone on on his shoulder according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Israel. So they were supposed to go back to where those guys were standing, gather a stone, and then come back across. That was just one of those things that, in my mind, I would have thought, hey, if we've already got this set up, as we're walking by, we can go ahead and gather a stone and whatnot. But that was not the case. God gave them instructions, and Joshua carried those out. So these 12 men crossed back over into the middle of the river once again. Verse 6 and 7 says this, "Let this be a sign among you, so that when your children ask later, saying, 'What do these stones mean to you?' then you shall say to them, because the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, when it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. So these stones shall become a memorial to the sons of Israel forever." They were told to gather these rocks. But these rocks were not for them. This was not for the people that crossed over. Because there's a really good chance that the people that crossed over were not going to forget what God had done in that place. They walked that. They had been in the camp when the two spies came back and told them how nervous Jericho was about this nation coming towards them. They had watched God part this water, and they were able to walk across on dry land. And we talked about that distance that God had spread out, how much of that river was dried up. They watched God do this miracle, and they walked across. These people didn't need a reminder of what it was that God had done. But they were told to gather a stone, one for each tribe, because it was going to be for the future generations to be reminded of what the Lord had done in that place. And so I ask us the question tonight is, how do we set up memorial stones? What are we doing to make sure that future generations can look back and see what God has done? What are we setting up that we can look and go, hey, you know what? I remember that was a time when God did this. See, this nation was told, hey, we're going to pick up 12 stones out of this middle of this river, and we're going to take them, we're going to gather them where we're lodging, and we're going to talk about that here in just a little bit, that distance that they had to walk with those stones. They gathered these stones, and they were supposed to set them up in camp, so that every time people walked by, the future generations could look and go, well, what are those stones for? Oh, let me tell you what God did. Let me tell you about what God did in this place. So the older generations could look and go, hey, you know what? Let me tell you a story about God's faithfulness. Maybe they hadn't seen God be faithful in 20 plus years. Maybe they hadn't had something this dramatic to be able to tell about, but God wanted a way for them to have something that when the younger generations walk by and they say, what is that pile of stones there for? And they say, well, let me tell you about what God did. You see that river, the Jordan River over there, that is a place where God caused the water to split. He dried up the river, and we were able to walk across. Me and your mom were able to walk across, and you were little, so you don't remember. I remember holding your hand as we walked across that river on dry land as God parted that with His presence. And hey, this guy from our tribe, maybe they knew that person's name. He may have been a prominent person, but this man was told to pick up a rock, and he brought it over here, him and 11 other guys. And this is where we set up this place so that we could remember what God has done. So what are we doing to set up those memorial stones? See, the thing about it is, I think it's important for us to remember what God has done in the past. We talk a lot about not living in the past. We don't want to live in the past, but we can celebrate what God has done in the past. God has done some incredible things in your lives. What do you have in your life that causes your future generations to look and go, Grandma, Grandpa, what was that? Tell me that story. Tell me what is this from? What is this thing right here? What does this mean to you? He says, oh, well, I can tell you about a time that God was faithful. I mean, it takes me back to those places, stores used to do this. I don't know if they still do it or not, but used to, you could walk into stores and somewhere around the cash register, there'd be a placard of that first dollar that store received. Convenience store would have it, and they might put a date on there of, hey, here's who it was. They might have had the owner and all the employees sign it from their first day. That was the first dollar that they had made, or first piece of cash or change that they had gotten. And that was a constant reminder of what God has done all the way through there, whether they're faithful or not. God was faithful, and He allowed that business to thrive as long as it did. And so they had that place of memory. But what I think is, I don't think that believers do a really good job of setting up those places for us to make it easy for us to tell about what God has done in our past. The book of Joshua has this in a few places. This is one of the first places where he says, hey, we're setting up these memorial stones. We want to remember what God did in this place, and we want future generations to ask, well, where did that come from? We're not told that they put any elaborate descriptions on there. We don't know that everybody from the tribe grabbed a Sharpie and signed the rock or anything like that. We're not told that they chiseled anything out. They may not have put them in a nice, neat-looking pile. It may have just been a pile of rocks, but it was enough that it was going to stand out that when future generations would walk by, in verse 6 it says that they would, when your children ask later saying, what do these stones mean to you? And then they'd be able to tell of God's faithfulness in that moment. So what are we doing to make sure that we have the opportunity to tell future generations of what God has done in our lives and in the life of our church, in the life of our community? How are we setting up those memorial stones, those landmarks for us to go back to, those reminders? See, the people here of Israel, that's what they were supposed to do, so that they could explain what those stones meant to them. Meaning they had a personal testimony about that moment. And future generations would continue to ask about that. And those stories would be passed on and on and on. So what are we doing to make sure that we get to tell the story of what God is doing in our life? See, I think for a lot of us, the only stone that we ever set up is a headstone. And somebody else has to tell that story. You don't get to. You've already spoke that story. Maybe you've preached that story. Maybe there's something there. But you're not getting to tell those future generations of God's faithfulness. See, I think it's important for us to take that opportunity to tell it from firsthand experience. I don't want my children to have to tell their children about how God's been faithful in my life. And I think a lot of you are in that same boat. Now, I don't know what my future holds. I don't know that I'll ever see grandkids. I have no idea. But if I'm given the opportunity to see that, I want to be the one that tells them about God's faithfulness in my life. I want to be the one that gets to tell them and say, hey, I can take you back to these places where God did this. I want to be able to bring them here and show them, hey, this was a place that I got to preach. I want to be able to drive by that. Who knows, I may still be here when I have grandkids. I'll be praying for y'all if that's the case. But I may still be here, and I may get to look at them and say, hey, right here, I remember January 1st, 2023, when I started my role as pastor at Highland Baptist Church. And I can tell you about the people that sat in those pews, and some of those saints are gone now, and some of them are still here, and we can relive that faithfulness together. I want to be able to do that myself. I want to be able to tell my kids about those things. But if I'm not setting up those markers, and I'm not saying you got to build shrines in your house or anything like that, but if I'm not setting up those markers or taking those opportunities to remind myself of those things, then they may never hear that story. They may not be able to pass that one on down. But God made sure that the people of Israel left something behind so that future generations could look and go, what do those stones mean to you? So what are we doing? How do we set up these memorials for ourselves? In what ways are we reminding not only ourselves but future generations of what God has done? See, because I think that's the thing that we've got to do is we've got to pass on that legacy to those future generations. Because y'all understand this. Our generations, your generation and all the generations behind you, they're getting a message. They're getting a message, and everybody's trying to paint that message of truth to what it is and what the world may think it is. And so it's our job to make sure that in this, that we are taking that opportunity to share the real truth of what God has done. And sharing that with them so that they can take that message and pass it on as well. And so hopefully they see God's faithfulness not only in our life, but they can look and go, you know what? God's done some of those same things for me too. But they were instructed nonetheless to set up these stones for future generations so that they would know about God's faithfulness and what God did in that place. Moving on to verse 8 and 9, it says this, "Thus the sons of Israel did as Joshua commanded and took up 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, just as the Lord spoke to Joshua, according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Israel. And they carried them over with them to the lodging place and put them down there. Then Joshua set up 12 stones in the middle of the Jordan at the place where the feet of the priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant were standing, and they are there to this day." I pause right there because verse 9 calls me to dig a little bit more. Verse 8 tells us that the sons of Israel did as Joshua commanded. They took those 12 stones and they carried them to where they were going to be lodging. Verse 9 then says that Joshua then set up 12 stones there in the middle of the Jordan. Most commentators will tell you that there were two memorials that were set up. And you may say, okay, well, why was there one in the middle of the Jordan? Because if it's not a dry season, you're not going to see it unless God dried it up again. Why would there be one set up there? Some people would tell you that, hey, it may make sense that verse 9 may be looking back to verse 8 in kind of retrospect, and Joshua had already set up these stones in the river, and these 12 men were then instructed to move those stones to camp to be set up there. Honestly, I lean more towards this idea that there were two different memorials that were set up there. Two different things that were set. Joshua left one in the middle of the Jordan where the priest stood with the Ark of the Covenant, and there was also the one that was at Gilgal, which is where they ended up camping. Now, a little known fact about Gilgal from the Jordan River, from what I read, is that that's a distance of about 8 miles. They carried a big, heavy rock, because if you had piled 12 little stones in a pile, there's not future generations that are walking by and going, what is that for? What? There's 12 of them, and they're stacked up neatly. No, that's not going to happen. These were large stones that these men would carry, and the estimates that I read said it was 8 miles to Gilgal. Now, they lodged there because they're just a couple of miles outside of Jericho. So they walk across the Jordan, then they go back to pick up their stones, and they carry them about 8 miles to Gilgal, to the camp. But my beliefs are that there are two different memorials that are set up. And I read this from Warren Wiersbe. I kind of summarized his thoughts on this. Is that the stones set up by Joshua is that they were most likely not seen very often, if at all. But the people knew about the monument and could still tell of it to future generations. And what he said in his commentary said it very well could have been a reminder that their past was buried and now they live a new life of obedience to the Lord. That's a commentator's view into this, of why would we put a monument in the middle of the Jordan River that people are not going to see. You might see it during a dry season, you might not, because if it's in the middle, we know it swells past its banks in the rainy season. I don't know that it ever dries all the way up in the middle of it. I don't know that fact about the Jordan River, but one of the interesting things, and I just thought it was a neat thought, that this could have been a place where when God covered that back up, He's saying, hey, you don't have to go back to who you were before. And one of the things that I've always thought about with memorial stones and setting up those landmarks in our life, when God does something in your life, He does something incredible, but He's never asking you that you have to go back to a time before that. You set up that landmark and you celebrate what God has done, and we are changed forever because we've seen that faithfulness. We've seen Him walk past all of those things. They crossed this barrier for them. The Jordan River had been a hurdle for these people for 40 plus years. It was a place that they got to and they weren't able to cross because they weren't faithful enough. They didn't believe God's plan. And so Moses then led them back into the wilderness for 40 years. Moses has died. That generation that didn't believe had died off. And now these people are back to the Jordan River yet again. And I don't see a place in Scripture where God told Joshua, hey, you need to set up another 12 stones. But we also don't see a place in Scripture where He said, Joshua, you shouldn't have done that. And so there's a chance that Joshua took this initiative on himself and he set it up in the place where they stood. Very well could have been as a reminder, hey, that you don't have to go back to who you were. You don't have to go back to who we were as a people before this moment. Because now we're walking into that promised land. Now we're walking into the place that God has promised us and all the people for so many generations. We don't have to go back to the slaves that we were. We now get to live in freedom in Christ. We now get to live in freedom as people of God. I don't know. I don't know if that's the reason that Joshua set up those stones there, but my belief is that there were two monuments that were set up there. One where they stood and one that was at their camp that would always be visible. So that when future generations walk by, they say, hey, yeah, you know what? This pile of stones right here may look just like the one where those guys stood in the middle of the water. And hey, maybe they come back during a drier season and say, hey, you see the top of that one rock right there? That's where they stood. I don't know. That's speculation on my part. But the beauty of it is God allowed them to set something up so that future generations could hear about His goodness. Continuing on, verse 10 says, for the priests who carried the ark were standing in the middle of the Jordan until everything was completed that the Lord had commanded Joshua to speak to the people, according to all that Moses had commanded Joshua, and the people hurried and crossed. And when all the people had finished crossing, the ark of the Lord and the priests crossed before the people, the sons of Reuben and the sons of Gad and the half tribe of Manasseh. That's the group that had their land was on the other side of the Jordan that they were going to be inhabiting, that God had given to them there. That's those 2.5 tribes there. They crossed over in battle array before the sons of Israel because their men of war were supposed to come with them, just as Moses had spoke to them. And it says in verse 13, about 40,000 equipped for war crossed for battle before the Lord to the desert plains of Jericho. That was not all of their people. That was not all of their battle-aged men. They would tell you, some commentaries that I read would say it was probably closer to 100,000 men that they would have had, but they sent some of theirs probably to leave some behind to protect the women and the children and the other generations that were to stay behind over there. But there were 40,000 that crossed over with the people ready to fight a battle. And verse 14 says, on that day the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel so that they revered him just as they had revered Moses all the days of his life. That is fulfillment of chapter 3, verse 8, where it says, you shall moreover command the priests who are carrying the ark. And it says, well, it's not verse 8, sorry. It's verse 7. It says, this day I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, that they may know that just as I have been with Moses, I will be with you. So he had reminded them, he said, hey, you know what, this is what we're going to do. That fulfillment is found there in verse 14 of Joshua chapter 4, going back to Joshua 3:7. Continuing on through there, it says, now the Lord said to Joshua, command the priests who carry the ark of the testimony that they come up from the Jordan. So Joshua commanded the priests, saying, come up from the Jordan. It came about when the priests who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord had come up from the middle of the Jordan, and the soles of the priests' feet were lifted up to the dry ground, that the waters of the Jordan returned to their place and went over all its banks as before. So just as God had orchestrated them walking into the river and it drying up as they stepped into it, He also orchestrated the time that they would come out of the river. And as soon as they stepped out of it, the water was there once again. I would love to be like, hey, this is how that happened. I have no clue. No clue how God could do that outside of His sovereignty and His all-powerfulness and all-knowing and just all those attributes that He had, that He would be able to orchestrate. That's one of those moments where you're saying, hey, it was God. Those priests carrying that Ark of the Covenant, they stepped in and hey, that ground got dry. And they walked to the middle, stood where they were supposed to, and the whole time they were there, they're on dry ground. And then Joshua tells them, hey guys, it's time to go. And they walk out, and as soon as that last one gets out and steps on that dry ground, that river is now overflowing the banks like it was before. It's just another one of those God moments. I've not found a commentary that tells me anything that says, hey, this is exactly how that happened that would make sense. It was God. And how great to have that testimony that they could look and go, hey, you know what? It was God who did a work here. It was God who did this, and we got to be a witness of it. How in tune are we with those things that God does that we can look and go, you know what? I have no explanation for it, but it was God. And let me tell you what He did. And that's what Joshua and the people were able to do for future generations. Reading on down through the remainder of the chapter there, verse 19 says, now the people came up from the Jordan on the 10th of the first month and camped at Gilgal. That's how we know where they were lodging, on the eastern edge of Jericho. Those 12 stones which they had taken from the Jordan, Joshua set up at Gilgal. He said to the sons of Israel, when your children ask their fathers in time to come, saying, what are these stones? Then you shall inform your children, saying, Israel crossed this Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan before you until you had crossed, just as the Lord your God had done to the Red Sea, which He dried up before us until we had crossed. And verse 24 says, that all the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is mighty, so that you may fear the Lord your God forever. This memorial was not just for Israel. It was not just a reminder for just the Israelite future generations. No, verse 24 says, so that all the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of your Lord is mighty. Just as the word went out when they fought those battles, and these Israelite people who shouldn't have won anything defeated these kings on their way to the Jordan River, just as the word would go out as they fight the battle of Jericho, just as all of those stories of the crossing of the Red Sea and them coming out of Egypt, all those things that struck terror into their future enemies. This was going to be another moment that the world would see God for who He is. There's a reminder there for us that the things that God does in our life are not just for us, and they're not just for our children, they're not just for our family, but those are stories of faithfulness that the world needs to hear. That's part of that gospel, that going and telling that we're supposed to do, is we're supposed to take these things that God tells us, the things that God does in our life, and we're supposed to take those with us. We're supposed to tell people, hey, let me tell you about His faithfulness. And they'll see the power of His mighty hand, as was said here. One last thing there. In that last line of verse 24, it says, so that you may fear the Lord your God forever. That you in verse 24 can actually be translated in the Hebrew to they. So if it's done that way, it would read this, so that they may fear the Lord your God forever. The things that God does in your life are not just for you. I am grateful for the things that God does in my life. But just because it's my story doesn't mean that nobody else gets to hear it or nobody else should hear it. The things that God is doing in your life, that's the testimony that you get to take to other people. That's the testimony that you get to share with other people. So what is it that God is doing in your life? What are those things that you can look and say, hey, you know what? I've seen God be faithful in this. I've seen God do these things. I've seen God do all of this. What are those things that where we can even metaphorically set up a memorial stone in our life where we can look back and go, I remember that time. I remember that time that God did this. We had prayed so many years, and then we saw His faithfulness. What are you doing to remember those things so that you can pass those on to future generations? Because I'll be honest with you, that's the truth that future generations need to hear. They're hearing what the world claims is truth. You're seeing that stuff on the news. You're seeing it on social media. These kids are bombarded with things that they're saying, hey, this is how you're supposed to be. You're supposed to deal with these issues. You're supposed to have these things. When in reality, Scripture tells us this is who God is. This is how He designed us to be. And this is what He desires for your life. That truth has to come from believers because the world's not teaching it. The problem is not all believers are teaching it either. So we've got to find our places where we can look and go, you know what? I may not know all of Scripture, but I know how God's been faithful in my life. And this is exactly what He's done. And I'm trusting He can do the same for you. Maybe that is God allowing you to bury parts of your past with that memorial that's in the middle of the river, but still setting one up so you can say, hey, I remember when we crossed that river and I don't have to go back across that again. I remember crossing that river. I remember crossing that bridge and we got to burn that bridge. We don't have to go back to it. God did some incredible things and I'll tell you about all the things that God did, but I don't have to go and live on that side of the river anymore. I get to move forward. I get to be what God has changed me to be now. Sometimes that's the story that we get to tell. Is the stories of change of what God has done. So many different places we could go with that. But I want to challenge you with what is God doing and how can you share that with future generations? How can you share that with future generations? How can you pass that on down to just a generation below you? How can you get that truth down to our students now? How can we incorporate that truth into our children as we're raising them up in the ways that they should go? They need to hear the truth from you, because if not, they're going to hear what they believe as truth from somebody else. And that's the last thing we want, is the world teaching our children how to follow different things. We want to teach them how to follow God. Amen. And we can do that through His faithfulness. Let's transition to a time of prayer. I know we're out of time, but we're going to go over this.